So let's go into the internet weather. And we had talked about the NetUSB vulnerability there just a few minutes ago. I was just kind of curious, so I looked in our internet weather to see, hey, is anybody scanning on port 20,005 TCP? And sure enough, there is. And that article came out on May 19th. And you could see somewhere in the afternoon on May 19th, somebody started scanning for it. Yep. And then they did another scan a little bit after there. It's not a lot, and when I looked at it, it's predominantly from sources in the US associated with a security research team. So this is some good guys that are probably trying to assess the threat landscape. You know, we said that from their report that it's pretty much only locally exploitable. You've got to be on the local LAN, but that they said, well, there might be a couple of vendors out there who are exposing this on the internet side, so that's probably what they're looking for here. And I don't think most of the, well, certainly security research time, probably not for malicious intent, but there were some lesser amounts from a couple of these US cloud dedicated server hosting ISPs where you can get like a, you know, your server your own. I don't know who they are or who's behind that activity, but to a lesser degree, there were some other actors doing the scanning as well. So something to keep an eye on. If you have, it's probably a good idea to read that story and then check if one of your devices is vulnerable to this. It's a lot of these home SOHO type routers for the most part. So if you do have that at home or in a small business, you'd want to go make sure that that gets patched when patches are available and whether or not it's exploitable on the internet side. So. In terms of the top 10 most probe ports, these are the ports that are scanned the most, just in sheer volume, not necessarily how many people are scanning them. So like one person could, you know, blow this whole chart out by scanning a bazillion attempts on a particular port. So I actually prefer the next chart a little bit better. But in general, there is a couple of interesting changes here because somebody did blow the chart out here, particularly with port 135 TCP. You'll see that it jumped up from position 23 to position 3 on the top 10 chart here. But we'll just walk through these real quick. So Telnet, port 23 TCP, and then SSH is the next one, port 22 TCP. We always know those are scanned a lot because they provide some sort of remote administration to the endpoint devices. 135 TCP is your Microsoft Endpoint Mapper. We're going to go take a look at a chart on that in a minute. Your 445 TCP, which is your SMB, that's mostly Conficker and other types of malware that's still looking for that old vulnerability that are out there still scanning for that. 8080 TCP is an alternate HTTP port. We see this a lot. There's a lot of like proxies hang out on this. Tomcat hangs out on this. There's some other content management systems that might have an administrative port on that port. So they're looking for various things. A lot of it is proxy oriented though, that when we actually look in our sinkhole or our honeypot traffic, we see that it looks like they're mostly looking for proxies. 443 TCP and 80 TCP is your web type traffic has moved up a little bit in the 443 TCP, down quite a bit in 80 TCP. We're actually going to go take a look at 80 TCP and why it's down so much from last week. You know, it went down 6 positions here. And then you've got your 53 UDP, which is DNS, 1900 UDP, which is your Simple Service Discovery Protocol, which there's a lot of activity of reflection scanning. So just like you could do DNS reflection scanning, or it's not scanning, DNS reflection attacks, where you reflect packets, they're doing that with SSDP, as well as 123 UDP, which is the network time protocol. So they use that for reflection attacks as well. So sometimes those get into the mix here. Looks like scanning, but in reality, it's probably attack traffic or people looking for devices. They could be scanning, looking for ones that will respond to that so that they can use it as part of their attack surface. So here's the 135 TCP. So remember how we said it moved up 20 positions there. We've had reported on this once before in the show, quite a ways back. So I guess you can kind of see here back in the March, this is a 60-day picture here. In the March and April timeframe, this was pretty elevated. We had a lot of activity, and then all of a sudden it went away. And it's been away for quite a while, and all of a sudden it kicked up again. So basically they're back. This is predominantly sources in China doing this scanning. To what end, I'm not quite sure. I did capture a couple of samples way back when it was happening in the March, April timeframe, but I don't remember what was in there, so I have to go find that again. One notable aspect of this scanning activity is they're using a static source port. So when you look at all the scanning activity, it's got a static source port of 4445, which normally, if something's making connections over and over again in scanning, that ephemeral port will keep incrementing. In this case, it's static, which is
so the scanning stopped this week and picked back up?
No, it stopped like April 16th, I'm going to say here.
Okay.
If you look at this, where it dips down here, and it's been down since about April 16th until May 17th or so. So May 17th is where it just kicked up again here, and that's where this big ramp up occurred here. Okay. The point I was going to make about that static source port is probably they're using a tool like ZMAP or mass scan to do some of this, scanning en masse, where they just kind of sit and listen on that ephemeral port and wait for packets to come back. And if they get a packet back, they know that something's listening on there, instead of trying to actually build actual TCP connections.
Do we know if the scan sources have changed since it went away, or is it?
I believe it was from China before, from what I remember. Actually, I know it was. I don't know if the address blocks that were involved are exactly the same, but we could go back and look at that. So I probably should. I just didn't get a chance to this morning. If it continues next week, we'll take a look and we'll see what it looks like. So the 80 TCP went down quite a bit from last week. And you'll notice there's this huge amount of traffic. And I think Brian covered this last week. I wasn't on the show last week, but I'm pretty sure I did some research on this and helped him for the show. So I think he had discussed this one. This is actually looks like scanning to us from our reporting systems, but what was really happening here is there was a big SYN flood against the game server hosting ISP in China. I'm not quite sure what kind of game servers they host. I looked at it, their web page, and it didn't translate in Chinese very well because a lot of it was graphic images that I don't speak Chinese, but in any event, it looked like this was more of a denial of service attack that occurred against them. For what purposes, I don't know. But when they were targeting, instead of targeting specific IPs, which we see a lot of times in denial of service attacks, they basically targeted every IP in a whole /23 address block that they manage, this game server hosting ISP.
So this is from last week we're looking at?
Yeah, so this big lump here, this is a 30-day picture. So this is about the May 8th time frame until May 14th, I'm going to say, is where all these big spikes occur.
So would you say we're back to a normal range?
Yes, we're back to a normal range now, yeah. So that's why it's gone down to normal again. And, in terms of volume, 80 TCP scanning is usually pretty high. It doesn't look high in here, but it actually is, because we're talking about it's not gigabytes, it's whatever, billions of flows per hour that we would normally see, and it went up to a lot more. It's like a 10 times increase here in terms of how much above the normal baseline we would normally see here. So that was pretty significant when it was going on last week. So this chart's the top 10 most sources probing. I like this chart a lot more because it basically means you've got a lot of sources doing something in unison together, which is usually an indication of botnet type activity or scanning that's occurring in some orderly fashion, like somebody's telling them all to do it, like a botnet. So no big surprise, 23 TCP is still high. It was last week #1 position. It is again this week. A lot of telnet scanning going on. I have some theories about what this is. It's probably some of these botnets going after these vulnerable routers, home routers. We've seen a lot of like the Linksys Moon botnet, which targets a lot of these home routers. And they are generally targeting 23 TCP because a lot of them have them open, exposed to the internet, which is not good. And a lot of times people buy these devices, they put it in their home network, and they plug it in, they plug all their stuff in, they say, I'm done. But they don't realize that it's got the default password on there of admin or whatever. So people get in, they put or bad guys get in, they put their malware on there, and now they're using your home router for some other purpose of their own to do some kind of botnet operations. So
yeah, well, and just like last week, though, the size of that slice of the pie is much larger than what we're used to seeing for any of them.
It's pretty significant. Yeah, it's almost probably, I can't do the math, I'm going to say like 40%, 35% of the chart, something like that maybe, right?
Yeah, it's more than a third, it looks like.
Yeah, it's pretty significant. But not as significant as it might have been in the past. So I'm going to show you a chart on that in a second here. Let's just run through these. I don't think there's anything really too interesting in here. We've talked about 4045 TCP. BitTorrent is in here. I don't really have a good explanation for this. So you've got the 6881 UDP and 6881 TCP, which have both jumped up a few positions from previous weeks. When I look at the actual chart, like a graph that we would show in the previous ones there, it really doesn't show any like huge swings in change of activity. So, even though it's moved up a couple of positions here, I don't think it's a giant change from its normal baseline. The 27015 UDP is Half-Life gaming server. This is not security relevant. This is just a kind of artifact of how that protocol works. 17788 UDP, we're attributing to this protocol called PP Stream, which is kind of a video streaming protocol that I don't really know a whole lot about, but we believe that that's probably what this activity is. I don't think it's malicious. I think it's just another kind of peer-to-peer thing that's kind of artificially looking like scanning, but maybe not really, really malicious in nature. Here's the 23 TCP chart. And so here's where we are today. We're at about, what is this, like 80,000 scan sources per hour, which is pretty significant. I think that's what we're looking at. Yeah, it's like 70 or 80,000 per hour. But in the past, we had gotten up to like 150,000. So this is back in the January timeframe of this year. So January 8th or 9th, I'm going to say, is this top peak here of about 150,000 scan sources per hour. So that was about double what it was today. Still, it's pretty significant. This is a lot of scanning activity. I'm not showing the actual amount of scanning activity as so much as I'm showing the number of sources participating in this activity. This also shows we've talked about this before, this kind of sawtooth waveform that you see, which is basically an artifact of the fact that a botnet operator might say, tell all his bots, okay, go start scanning. And you've got these FiOS ones, or ones that are on really high-speed networks that complete quicker than other ones on slower networks, their scanning activity. So you kind of get this kind of sawtooth as they decay off here, as some finish and others take longer to finish their jobs that they get scheduled to do for scanning. So that's kind of where we're at now. This is a lot of activity. So if you have a home router, or if you have anything exposed with Telnet, first of all, I say, why are you using Telnet? You should be using SSH. And then secondly, I would say, even if you are using SSH, limit your connectivity to only sources that you trust. There's no reason to open that up on the internet to sort to the entire internet. Open it up to sources or address blocks that should be able to telnet in or do administrative type activities.